All right, good afternoon. Can you guys all hear me? Cool, that works. So we're gonna have fun as we go about it, and there's only a handful of you, so it's gonna be mandatory audience participation. And I'll pick on all of you if I have to. So the title is ever so slightly different if you've noticed versus what was in the program. So one of our technology partners, Beyond Trust, was not able to make it. They asked me to come in and fill in. So I'm still going to talk about PAM, don't worry. But I'm also going to talk a lot about ICAM and a lot about Zero Trust and really show how those link together. I won't be able to go quite as deep in the PAM realm. However, in the ICAM realm, you can go as deep as you want. And this is definitely interactive. So, will be time at the end for questions. There'll be a little bit during the presentation as well. So who I am, I'm Brian Rosensteel. I'm the US Federal CTO for Ping Identity. I've been working in the actual FICAM space. We'll get to what ICAM means here in just a minute. But in that federal ICAM space for, I don't know, something like 13 years now, public sector broadly over 20 years. And really have been watching the space develop. And really, once we saw Zero Trust come in and a couple other key events that we'll get to in a minute, watching the identity space really take off in its importance and seeing almost a resurgence again within, privileged access management and PAM and the merger of these different technologies together. Because before, they were isolated silos. You would have your PKI system, that's where I got my start. You would have your directory system. Maybe they talked to one another, they probably didn't. And you may have something for your administrators if you were lucky, and if you did, that was an entirely separate system as well. Now it really has become something where those must work together. Because if they're not, it's not going to scale, and it's not going to meet the challenges of what we're seeing from our adversaries today. And we'll show a couple examples of where some of those failures have been and how it's influenced what we're seeing today and the policies coming out. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about ICAM, we're going to talk a little bit about Zero Trust, and we're going to be referencing back to PAM quite a bit in the process while we do it. So, I promised you that I was going to pick on people. Anyone want to take a stab at what ICAM, and I actually defined it, Identity, Credential, and Access Management, what that actually means for an organization? Yeah, go ahead.
Authorization, making sure that the people that should have access to and the people who don't have access to.
So what she had said, for those who couldn't hear, is, ICAM being more about authorization, making sure that people who are trying to access things should have that access, which is a really good definition, and not one that I typically hear for ICAM. So we will get to that definition here in a moment and see how close you are based upon what the government defines it, but I like it. We're going to do the same thing for PAM. So who wants a back scratcher? Go ahead and take a shot. It's all right. It's, not graded. And then PAM, of course, is Privileged Access Management for those not familiar. So anyone want to take a stab at what we kind of consider to be a definition around PAM or an example? Like I said, I will call on you if I have to.
I guess I'm just guessing, but it's obviously like, different layers of security. You have different, are you at a TS, a TSSCI level? What are you authorized to see? What privileges do you have associated with that?
Okay.
But I'm guessing.
No, and that's fine. Like I said, this is not graded yet. So her response, if you didn't hear, was, privileged access management might be something around really the entitlements of a user, right? We think about it from the compartmentalization that we have up in some of our networks, right? You think of our TS networks and, okay, well, you have these containers associated with you, so maybe you're able to access these things, which I think, as you'll see, it's a slightly different definition, but the realm of where you're going is, I think, in line with modern thoughts. And you get a back scratcher.
Is it more like the administrator can change configuration?
That's right. Yeah. So you basically made the clarification that, yeah, it's those types of things, but it's focused on an administrator. And that's much closer to the definition that I'll pull here in a minute, so is it good? And then the last one, zero trust. Anyone want to take on this definition? I'm going to let you do it first, and then I'm going to have fun with it. Go ahead.
It's a framework to establish least privilege.
Framework to establish least privileged. Short, sweet, to the point. And you get a back scratcher.
Oh, sweet. I just sat down. This is awesome. Shukran, baby.
So here's what's fun about Zero Trust. I've been on a bunch of panels for Zero Trust. They have me come on all the time for my identity background. And several of those panels have had all of us. There'll be like 5 of us, and we're all industry experts, right? And they'll say, define Zero Trust. And every single one of us has a different definition. So Zero Trust was the hardest to try to get, pinpointed down, but that's not a bad, kind of least privileged and, kind of controlling that access. As we'll see as we break it down, that's pretty close. So what does the government define these different acronyms, right? And we have acronyms for acronyms. Let's have fun. So ICAM, or Identity Credential Access Management, right, it's that set of tools, policy systems that the agency uses to enable the right individual to access the right resource at the right time for the right reason, support of federal business objectives. Very similar, actually, to the definition that you gave. Notice, most people, when they think of identity, they're going to think of their CAC card, or they're going to think of their driver's license. They're going to think of their passport, right? What is my credential that I use to log in? It's focused around authentication. But this definition, while authentication being important, the right individual, is far more concerned with the access controls that individual has and ensuring that they're doing what they need to do for their mission need. It is focused around authorization. And so that's something that's really important. And we'll later on talk about the difference between authentication and authorization. But as we go through this, and especially as we start to think of what we need to do for our privileged users, authorization and entitlements are what really enable us to lock these systems down. So let's go into our next one, right? PAM, Privileged Access Management. That's consisting of cybersecurity strategies and technologies. It's really around exerting control over privileged access and permissions for the user's accounts, processes, systems across an IT environment. By the way, both of these definitions are not something I made up. They come from the FICAM architecture, one of the FICAM playbooks that come out, and just playbooks in general out of the GSA. So similar to how kind of both of you had defined, we're really talking about the access control around the entitlements, but it is focused and narrowed. So a similar definition to ICAM, but focused only on our administrators. It's a limited scope. Now, when we deal with PAM, we actually start dealing with different types of things that we might want to examine versus in an ICAM system. I'll give a couple examples of those as we go later on, and where some of those differences might be, especially when we deal with logging and auditing and things of that nature. But it is far more targeted to a subset of users. And then the last one, the hardest one to define. So I cheated. I used CISA's definition out of their Zero Trust Maturity Model. Zero Trust provides a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize uncertainty and enforcing accurate, least privileged, so you were very close in your definition, per request access decisions in information systems and services in the face of, and I think this is important, a network viewed as compromised. Zero trust, assume breach. That's where that little tagline comes from. We should assume the system's compromised. So, in a compromised system, how do we reduce the uncertainty to know that those individuals are still able to do what they need to do? It's a very different mindset from before, where we're like, well, we're going to make sure the bad guys can't get in. Now, we know this, right? We've been hearing the zero trust being pounded down for quite some time now. And really the question becomes, and this is going to be another audience participation. I promise there's going to be lots of these. How important are ICAM and MFA, multi-factor authentication, for anyone who wants that definition? Like I said, we have acronyms for acronyms in the government, to the successful implementation of zero trust. So any takers on where that might sit, when you might need to be implementing that, whether you think the whole thing is just, smoke and mirrors, I'll take anything. You look like you're burning to say something.
I'll say it's critical
Why do you think it's critical?
because you can't have zero trust
Yeah. So as an identity person, I love that answer, that it's critical and it's the foundation. So you definitely get a back scratcher. Right. So regardless of what model you look at, if it's a CISA model for zero trust with the 5 pillars, or the DoD model that has 7 pillars. Oh, by the way, the CISA model sits on 2 steps, so it's still 7. It's just drawn differently. All of them have the same consistency, right? The identity pillar or the user pillar is on the far left. When we look at our definition of zero trust and it talks about least privileges, how are we defining privileges? We're looking at entitlements. We're looking at the identity of that individual. We're bringing them from an unknown to a known state. Zero trust is not actually the best way to explain that concept. Because it's not that it's zero trust. It's zero inherent trust. We must build the trust every single time, and we have to make sure that we're not just taking it for granted. This becomes ever more important when we get to our PAM systems. So that brings us into our kind of fundamentals, if you will, of zero trust, right? And these build upon one another. And they build in, even though they're simple to put up on a screen, and the difficulty to execute. The first is, who has access to what? Did anyone here actually think that they could run a pretty simple analysis in their entire environment and enterprise and figure out that answer? Because I know when I was working on site, that was absolutely not, right? But once,
GPOs you have.
yeah. Well, and how many forests and how many of them are disconnected, and then, Especially when you deal with the PKI world that I came from, we never failed an audit about having people have access that no longer is with the organization. So the next part is, okay, if we know who has access to what, here's the harder question. Should they have that access? There's always the joke, but it's not a joke, about the private who's been in the military their entire career, and by the end of their career they have more accesses than a general. Because as they've moved from MOS to MOS in each of their positions in their career, they've gained entitlements. We're good at giving them the access they need, and we forget to turn off the access they don't. And we get into situations where we've got what we call toxic combinations of attributes and privileges. Okay, you are in finance, and now you're in contracting. Well, you shouldn't be able to look at both systems at the same time, and yet we never turn those off. So that's even more difficult than understanding who has access. And then the last question, and this is really where PAM is centered, what are they doing with that access? And how do we have the confidence that we understand, that we know what they're doing with that access? And what events should we be looking at, and what events is it okay not to look at? Because the other thing is you can't necessarily examine everything all at once. You should really be understanding what is important to examine when. Because if you go too deep into it, all of a sudden now you've got terabytes or more of logging information, and the vast majority of that is noise. How do we filter that down into what's relevant? That's what makes this difficult, and that's what makes this a challenge. So yeah, it's not an easy topic. Super easy for me to put on a slide. So the next part is we get to have a little bit of a history lesson. This is kind of fun. Evolution of zero trust in the government, and I'm going to look at a couple different kind of catalytic events. The first is actually what we see, the formulation of NIST Special Publication 800-207. This gets mandated and published a few years after the OPM breach. For those who aren't familiar with the OPM breach, what was the cause? Compromised administrative credential. They did not have a PAM system in place that was really linked up with their ICAM system to be able to prevent that unauthorized access. As a result, we see the leak of a vast amount of sensitive information out of OPM. We see the government respond, we need to get serious about zero trust. NIST give us guidance. 800-207 gets mandated and gets born. Then we see another one that changes this from guidance to policy. And that's Executive Order 14028. This is much newer. This comes out in May of 21. What is the catalyst? Not that this document didn't exist in a draft before then, but what was the example of, hey, this just came out, now we can seize on this opportunity and be able to release this out into the public? In many ways, it was the result of the colonial pipeline. Well, what happened during Colonial Pipeline? Compromised administrative credential. There's a theme here. When the admin credentials get compromised, it is far more detrimental to an organization than a regular user credential. Not that user credentials aren't important to protect, but the admin credentials are very much crown jewels. So in the Colonial Pipeline attack, we have an old admin account. I say old because it was actually deprecated for use. It should not have been in an active state, yet still is in an active state. It was able to be compromised through phishing or other means, and then the attackers were able to go in. A lot of people point out, hey, if only it had MFA. I point out, hey, that thing was supposed to be disabled months in advance. That's an identity silo. That's an admin account that isn't being managed with the rest of the enterprise. That's your problem. Yes, MFA would have helped, but that wasn't the root cause of that scenario. And as a result, for any of us on the East Coast, we had to put gasoline in trash bags. I'm not sure why, but I know that that's what the news told me I had to do. So, what do we see? Well, we now have seen actions taken. We have OMB Memorandum 22.9 out in the civilian space released. They have things like the 3 things you need to do in the identity, right? So in Section A, they talk about centralizing identity management. They talk about using phishing-resistant MFA. They talk about leveraging device signals when you're doing any type of authorization event. Sounds great. Well, in response, we see from the DoD something that's far more laid out. We see the 91 target controls, and we see 61 advanced controls for a total amount of 152 different controls. And yes, this will be on the exam at the end, so I hope you can read it. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different things here across all 7 pillars. And if you've read each one of these, it's not just about the title, but there's a description for each. And for people like me who get popcorn and get giddy over this stuff, yes, I have read it. And there's a central theme going through it. And a lot of that theme is good logging details, being able to properly digest those logs. It's not just about, hey, can you get a whole bunch of logs and put them over by the water cooler? It's about, can you make sense of that data? And then can you take action accordingly from it? And there is a theme throughout it around maintaining those entitlements and access. So then this begs the question, because this wasn't just a talk about zero trust, and for a lot of us this is review, it's, can you make this work, especially around ICAM, especially around PAM, in these environments? And there's a lot of pushback around that. There's a lot of people saying, you really can't get a zero trust environment in a DDIL, in a TICAM environment. And there are challenges, and understandable challenges to that. So, obviously I'm going to give you my opinion as we go forward. Before I do need to go through and define a little bit of what DDIL is and what TICAM is. By the way, this definition of DDIL, I have looked it up, and I have seen no less than 6 different wordings of it. So if this is different than what you're used to, forgive me. That's not my fault. But in general, we're talking about denied, distributed, intermittent, and limited impact environments, right? Reading that off the slide. What we're talking about is environments that you cannot take for granted consistent connectivity across your enterprise. It really is this little isolated network that may or may not be in communication. But at some point, you should expect it to be in communication. It's a really interesting environment. It's a really fun environment for me, as someone focused on federal, to try to explain to people who don't work in federal. And like, well, what do you mean? Like, I'm just going to connect it to the internet. Well, that's not a thing. The other part about this is TICAM, Tactical Identity Credential and Access Management. This is even more controversial. You'll talk to some people and say, well, TICAM doesn't exist, or the use cases don't exist. And other people say, well, that's the tactical edge. That's the spearhead. The battlefield of tomorrow will be fought just as much in cyberspace as it's going to be fought on the actual beaches and on the ground. And we have seen that already taking place in the modern conflicts throughout the world. So are these different? Well, in many ways, TICAM is a subset of DDIL environments. They're more challenging and more restrictive. DDIL environments, and some of the examples that I'll give, you have a lot more room when it comes to the actual infrastructure to be able to lay out your solutions. TICAM environments might be a box that you kick off the back of an airplane, and it's going to be in a forward operating base. So a lot more restrictive, a lot more challenging. But in the end of the day, it still comes down to an environment that may or may not have consistent connectivity. So as we go forward and we talk about this, that's what you should be thinking about. So, another opportunity for mandatory audience participation. What do you think are some considerations when you attempt to implement the Zero Trust framework in a DDIL environment? Or what is a way, I'll give you a different opportunity as well, that you think a strategy that just simply couldn't work? Any takers?
You can't be depending on the internet connectivity to tell you if your people that are connected are okay.
That's right, yeah. So your strategy should not be reliant upon an internet connectivity. That's something you can't take for granted. You can get a second back scratcher if you'd like. Okay. I don't know, you collect a whole set. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Authorizing every packet and everything that happens, doing that at scale, needing a controller at every DDIL site. Massive problem to manage.
Right. So let me ask on. So basically, what was said was being able to analyze every packet for basically everything going on across all the DDIL sites is a massive challenge. Are you talking about trying to do that centrally or doing that within each site?
Centrally doesn't exist in DDIL.
Yes, centrally doesn't exist in DDIL, which is absolutely fair.
So how do you scale that out to everywhere, right?
Right. How do you consistently scale that given each environment in some way exists on its own? So of course you get a back scratcher. And here's what's really fun. When you talk to a lot of people about Zero Trust and you talk to them about identity especially, they will give you the story of the idealized identity policy, right? This centralized identity management system that's going to work in any device, any directory, any location, any application and cloud. Obviously, that will never work. Certainly is going to be challenging in commercial environments where you'll hear this, communicated a lot. I've heard some people say, well, don't worry about your challenging air-gapped environments. We'll just have it tunneled so that we can have it work over there. And I say, well, you do understand the definition of air-gap, don't you? Right? We know this doesn't work. And why doesn't it? Well, I'm sure we could all give our different definitions, but I always like to explain it to people around our magic data centers. So think of a data center that we're going to have work anywhere in the entire world, and whenever it wants to, it's going to shut off communication at, maybe or maybe not. We'll get notification for it, and we'll get a window of when it might come back on. We're not entirely certain. And for fun, we're going to make it work under the ocean. Of course, I am third-generation Navy, so I am not talking about magic data centers. I'm talking about submarines. Yes, that doesn't work with anything that's in some centralized system. It's going to have to stand alone. So how do we get away from the existing of, I have all of these different environments that are out there, so I'm going to have individual bespoke systems for each one that then I have to manage, and heaven help me with the SOPs and the sailors and admins and everyone, they're going to have to learn those systems across all of those environments. How do I get consistency? Because I can't do a centralized system. Well, what it's going to look like architecturally at first may not make sense, right? We're going to have, very realistically, cloud environments out there that are going to be servicing the broad enterprise, right? Our CONUS operations might be out in the cloud. Now, we'll, for continuity of operations, still have to have another system out in headquarters, probably still over in CONUS, right? Because if connectivity goes down to the internet, they can't go down. You can't have a concept of failing open or failing closed. We can't fail. Our missions are too important. So I got another ICAM system stood up, right? And I'm going to put another ICAM system for every DDIL environment. Well, now I've got ICAMs all over the place. And I've got my air-gapped environments out there, and my more sensitive networking environments out there. No way that's going to work either, right? Like, now we've got this hodgepodge. That's where we were before. That's what caused problems before. So how is this different? The difference is to standardize our approach for every ICAM environment. Deploy these as, whatever acronym you want to use. Infrastructure as code. If you want to do it, configuration as code, documentation as code. Try to find solutions that are rinse and repeat across all of these environments so that when my sailor or my soldier or my airmen have to be trained, we train them on the functionality necessary to perform the mission that is independent of the environment where it gets deployed. Same UI interfaces. And this exists. We call this full feature parity. And these options are out there. And we think that's really critical because we can't have these bespoke deployments and we can't wait. Well, we're going with this SaaS environment, but 6 months down the line, we might get that other feature that we really want that we only have on premise. That doesn't scale with us. We need to make something that we can say, okay, we've done some testing, we want to bring in this new configuration. Now that we have that configuration from a DevOps perspective, we can then make that a package that gets available to send down to all the environments. Now we understand those DDIL environments aren't in constant communication, but when they come back online, they can grab that configuration, bring it down to their local system, and then be able to deploy that. Or my TICAM environment that's going to be in maybe my, my little data center in a box, right? The snow cones and snow blades of the world. Well, I will have that containerization beforehand that I can load onto those systems. Then when I kick it off the back of the airplane, it's got the latest configuration, and I know that's going to be a short-lived deployment, so I'm okay whether or not it communicates back. But my operators know how to work with it because it's the same thing they're working with regardless in the rest of the environments. That's how we're going to be able to scale. That's how we're going to be able to make this work. By the way, that's not a pipe dream. This is something that's been going on. This is what you will find with some of the initiatives out there in mission partner environments. Hey, we're testing this, right, in all the different labs. We know how to make this work. Here are the configurations. Here's the documentation. Now you can deploy this on your own, and oh, by the way, these things have heartbeats so they can communicate with one another when that connectivity exists. All right, so we get another opportunity. I haven't run out of back scratchers yet. So what are some of the primary requirements to implementing Zero Trust Framework? How do we go about achieving these capabilities? Anyone have any thoughts on this? By the way, I've hinted at a few of them already, and we're going to go down into a different area here in just a minute. Any takers? Like I said, I'm happy to point on people if I have to. Pointing at you. You sat farthest from me. Just ICAM? You just going with ICAM? Yeah, I like it. So, yeah. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, we keep talking about authorization. Authorization is a great word to sling around, but what does it actually mean, right? And what's the difference between authentication? Because you'll hear a lot of people talk about authentication and authorization as if they're the same thing and they're interchangeable, but they're absolutely not. They are distinct things with distinct missions and objectives. So we're going to go over both. And these aren't outdated. These are what you would see in a modern zero trust implementation. When we talk about ICAM modernization, we're talking about attempting to achieve this. And we see this actually being pushed across the government. So one of the first times ever in FIPS 2013, Section 7, by the way, that's the PIV standard. It's also what CAC gets aligned to. Previously, PIV was all about authenticating directly to the application. Revision 3 comes out in January of 2021. In Section 7, they say, as much as possible, you should not be authenticating directly to the application. You should be authenticating instead to a federation engine through single sign-on. Why are they saying that? Why do we see that in Memorandum 22.9? Why do we see that hinted at within the DoD Zero Trust controls? It's because of what that allows you to do. So when we break this down, our users attempting to access the application, but they're redirected over into the federation engine. Now the policy orchestration and what makes this authentication adaptive takes over. So our user gets pushed over into a device registration and control check in this example. This, by the way, is totally configurable. This isn't where you're locked in. But what are we doing? We're saying before I'm going to expose the multi-factor authenticator of this user, I want to make sure that the device they're coming from is trustworthy. This is that idea, zero inherent trust. I cannot trust that the hardware being used by this user is something that is acceptable to even expose my multi-factor authenticator. I can't necessarily do that if I'm authenticating directly to the application, but because I've abstracted away, I can throw that in. Well, what can I do? Maybe I want to go over and I want to talk to an MDM, like a Microsoft Intune or something like that. Maybe I want to talk to an XDR system, like a CrowdStrike, get a risk score analysis come over. I've got a technology partner that can take it even further. They've got agents that you can embed deeply on devices. Those agents can give me information out of the registry of Windows, or even deeper than that. They can give me information out of BIOS. They can tell me what the chipset is on the motherboard out of the BIOS readings. Think about that. I've deployed to a TICAM environment. I know the hardware that went out, right? I sent it out there. I can go and check to make sure that that's what's being used during that authentication session. And if it differs, then maybe I need to deny it. And maybe I never want to expose that multi-factor authenticator, whatever it may be, because I already know I cannot trust this authentication attempt. That's the power that you get when you abstract the authentication away. So now let's complete the story. Everything checks out, my device registration and control check, and now I go ahead and I prompt the user for multi-factor authentication, right? MFA has completed, everything is great, and what results of authentication? I'm allowed to gain access to the application. That's all authentication aims to do. Can you get into this application? Yes, no. Can you prove that you are who you are? That's very different than saying you should even be trying to get there in the first place. So we think about multi-factor authentication a lot because in the name, MFA is authentication or authenticator. We kind of use those interchangeably because we love to make acronyms as confusing as possible. But we know that MFA is actually not enough to secure our resources. You have to do authorization. So I love, and again, I've got PKI in my veins. I've deployed some of those crypto systems throughout the government. And I will be the first person to tell you that PKI, that's underneath CAC, that's underneath PIV, that's actually underneath our passport systems, only thing they can tell you is proof of possession of private key. It can't actually tell me whether or not you should be logging into that system in the first place. And that's why we say that authentication is merely the enabler of authorization. Notice, when we were in our authentication model, what was going on? We weren't just interrogating the user, we were discovering everything about the digital identity of that user. We were learning about the device they were coming from. We were learning about the multi-factor authenticators that they were using. We were gathering information along the way as we were bringing that person from an unknown to a known state. Now authorization takes over. Authorization has a different goal. Does this identity have the right permissions to perform this action? It's singular. So we can take our directory attributes, who this user is, what attributes we know about them, right? Typical role things, and start looking at the context. What device did they come in from? What MFA did they use? What are they doing at this time? Because maybe they are an administrator, and maybe they are using a multi-factor authenticator they should be using. But if they're coming from a device that's untrustworthy, we may not want them to do all actions. But it doesn't need to be blanket denial. Maybe they're allowed to go in and perform 50% of their duties, but the more sensitive duties we need to restrict out. The only way we start getting more granular in these access control policies for our privileged access management and other things within ICAM is if we've done the discovery during authentication to pull that data around that context in the first place. That's why we say authentication is the enabler of authorization. And authorization, as we know from our definitions in the beginning, is really where we're aiming and seeking to get to. The other part about this is, again, this is a singular action. What does that actually mean? It means as a user, every time I interact with the system, I make another authorization event. Okay, so I've logged in. I'm going to run a command. Am I allowed to run that command? Okay, cool. You were allowed to run that command. Now I'm going to do it again. Well, guess what? You're going through another authorization event. And again, and again, and again, with every action the user does. This is where you hear about continuous monitoring, continuous authorization. That's what we're talking about. It's not that you're spinning cycles and basically running those diagnostics continuously if the user's doing nothing. Now we might want to do that because of session management after a certain amount of time, but we're actually more interested in just following the user as they're performing these actions and doing the authorization events then. It reduces those compute times and it's a lot more sense from a logical perspective. This is what we talk about, this zero trust orchestration, right? We're looking at, after we've done the detection, what do we know about the user? What's that device they're coming in from? Now let's look at the context, right? Do we need to change the authentication that they used? Maybe they logged in with FIDO. But FIDO doesn't have the non-repudiation that we need to perform this other event that's important to us. Or maybe they came in with a phishable credential. And that might be okay, right? They use that push authenticator on the mobile device. But we know that's not phishing resistant, and now they're trying to perform this more sensitive, action. All right, well, hey, guess what? Now you have to go and you have to log in with your CAC. You can't do this without using this stronger authenticator method. And that's what then drives that dynamic authorization that we've been talking about as you try to go and gain access to data, applications, resources. So if we go in and we think about different things within PAM, what are we really talking about, right? We've built this model out. We know this information about these users. We've got this detail that we can start going in for contextual authorizations. Well, we can really leverage that across all of these different accounts and systems. We can then, as we're storing and managing the different privileged and non-privileged credentials, we can start having policies tailored to each. As we build out our identity stores, our master user records, we can then have attributes associated with it so that our policy engines pick that up very quickly and make those changes very dynamically. And then I think one of the things that's most important of all is managing and monitoring access to resources. So this comes down to, and this is where PAM differs a lot from some of the things that I deal with within ICAM. Now my ICAM systems feed my partners, my PAM partners, because I'm going to do that discovery, I'm going to build out those attributes, and I'm going to send it over to those systems. And that's going to enable them to be able to do, kicking types of events of like, oh, this administrator's coming in, but they're coming in from a location they've never come in before. Now maybe this is critical. Maybe it's mission critical, and we are making an exception. But we're going to do extra enhanced logging because the riskiness has been elevated. So it's not a blanket denial. And that's the old static rules of the past. You can only do this if you meet these criteria. What we're saying now is we're still going to allow you to do it, but we're going to do extra interrogation because we're not just going to give you that inherited, zero inherited trust. And we can actually extend this into other things as well. So I always like to go back and talk about, in the beginning I talked about in DDIL environments about doing containerization and how important that is because that gives us feature parity across and allows us to scale. Well, DevOps itself actually really needs ABAC and some of this privileged access management. Because how we've done DevOps previously, well, we kind of have shared admin keys. Those shared admin keys, sometimes they're PKI keys. Well, all right, I got to check in this image. Well, I use that key in order to do it. What we need is something that's tailored to the individual. So you're going to log in with your user credential. You're going to get a short-lived credential that you never deal with, right? That's part of what PAM systems can do. And then you're going to be able to check in or out that build for that containerization. So now I have logging tailored to an individual, not a shared key. I have the actual key that's going to be used to get to these sensitive builds and completely abstracted away from the end user. As much as we can do that, the better from an enhanced security perspective. And I have logging that I can go back to later on that's more meaningful. It's not just, hey, this build was checked in. It's this person did this at this time with these entitlements, this type of multi-factor from this type of device. I've got something that I can look at. If in the future an incident recurs, we don't want that to happen, but hey, zero trust. We assume it's a compromised system. I have better logging that I can go in and I can examine to be able to make sure that I understand what the differences were. And maybe that might help me to get to a root cause much faster. That's part of what we see, by the way, in OMB Memorandum 2131 around the enhanced levels of logging. They really want it to where it's not just you're logging everything just to log it, but you're getting more meaningful information out of these data. So we get into device signaling, right? Another type of fun question here. This one's a little bit more open-ended, right? What are other persons, other things that might fall into the category that we have to protect, right? That could be privileged roles. And then how can we control when and where they have access? Well, that second one you could probably guess. Well, what about the first one? Any takers? We've talked a lot about the user behind the keyboard. Hint, hint. Services accounts are a great one. It's actually beyond service accounts too. That's the better definition I was looking for. NPE, non-person entity. You are going to get a back scratching, but I'm going to speak first. NPEs are what we're seeing coming out more and more. This is something that is expanding in definition every day. And we're used to it, right? We're actually surrounded by it in this conference right now. As we deal with not just OT with, our critical infrastructure, but IoT environments, the interaction and what consists of a user is changing almost daily. And yet we still need to be protecting access to those types of accounts and systems, and we still need to account for them because some of those, especially service accounts, have elevated privileges that are absolutely loved by attackers because it's not something that's protected by an individual user, and it's something usually I can turn sideways and start moving laterally across the system. So yeah, NPs are something we definitely need to take account for. All right, so now we're going to get into really kind of the last area. This is fun. RBAC versus ABAC. We're going to have it duking out between the different acronyms, right? RBAC is role-based access control, and I really have been a little bit of a broken record that that's not enough. And you've probably seen that throughout the theme today of what I've been talking about, right? In general, especially in the past, RBAC really employed a static, simple logic. You only get in if you're a member of these groups, right? You have to be an admin to perform this action, or if you're an auditor, you only get read-only privileges. Now, by the way, that's unfair. There are systems out there that are seeking to use AI/ML to make RBAC more dynamic. So historically, it was static. Now, there's definitely ways of making RBAC something that's a lot more reactive and make sure that entitlements come and go far more quickly, and that's great. But we're still limited on our access decisions that aren't taking real-time context into consideration. Example I always love to give is I have an administrator coming in. That administrator is logging in with a system they should log in from. They're logging in with a multi-factor authenticator they should be using to log in. They absolutely have access to that application. They absolutely have the right entitlements to perform the action that they're doing. And yet I still need to deny them. If I'm only looking at RBAC, everything looks great. But when I look at the broader context, I see they're actually attempting to perform this on a Saturday. And they're only contractually allowed to be in Monday through Friday. This is an issue. Now, it might be that we have an emergency situation going on and we need to be able to enable this user to be able to perform this action at this time. So again, maybe not blanket denial, maybe it's enhanced logging. Maybe I need to open up a remote session where I'm actually recording everything they do because it's so far out of context from what we expect. But we're never going to be able to do that with RBAC. But we can do that with ABAC, attribute-based access control. So with ABAC, we're looking at as many attributes as what our systems can handle and what makes sense. We're looking at the determination of the risk of each attempt access, and we're adjusting our permissions as needed. So does this mean that we ditch RBAC? No. Actually, it's unfair, because it's not RBAC versus ABAC. It's just ABAC, because role-based access control is a subset of attributes within ABAC. What we're really saying is just expand what you're looking at and understand that even if it's worked in the past, it's not going to continue to work because our threats have gotten more sophisticated, our attacks have gotten far more clever. So we do need to look at all of these other contextual pieces and bring that in. So we want to get as granular as possible with ABAC, and that makes sense for everything across the entire organization, correct? Again, I'm setting you up. No. There are different levels of authorization that you actually should be thinking about. Everything from coarse-grained, can you get into the application? Yes, no. Medium-grained, can you get into this part of the application? To fine-grained. Conditional and contextual. Should you be allowed to execute this one API? Should you be able to get into this data? Do we need to strip out where 80% of the data you're requesting is fine, but 20% is not okay, right? Do we need to make it so that, yes, as an admin, you can do work on that data table, but no, you shouldn't actually be able to see the values in that data table, Now, the reason why I say that all three of these are important is because we have to think about overkill. We have, as an example, a timekeeping application. Do I really need to go through fine-grained access control where I'm looking at APIs on my timekeeping application for a regular user? Probably not. I might want to get more granular if they're an admin, sure. But I have to take that context in consideration and that application sensitivity. Because if I'm constantly trying to boil the ocean and do all this granular level access control, I'm not going to get anywhere. But the more sensitive applications, we should be drilling down. And that allows our approach to the way that we do our rollout to be a lot more realistic. And our management to be a lot more realistic as well. So that's all I had kind of prepared to kind of talk to you about and throw back scratchers at you. However, I do want to open it up for any type of questions that you may have, or any discussion that you want to bring up, or any examples as well. And you can sit there if you want, and we also have that mic working, I think, as well. So, any questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, all right, go ahead. So part of the question was kind of in my experience, given what I've talked about, how far along do I think most of kind of the government is, or the customers that I've dealt with around implementing these ICANN modernization features, as well as some of the more granular access controls within privileged access management as well. And my answer to that is, it is a mixed bag, but unfortunately, the vast majority of them are pretty far from it. So when OMB Memorandum 22.9 came out, I actually talked with CISA about it, and I said, hey, you didn't really include anything deep level within PAM, deep level within ABAC. Like, you touched on the surface and then you just walked away. Why? Authorization is far more important than authentication. And they said, yep, we completely agree with you. We just really need to get the government over into federation. So they know it's a problem, but they're not even mandating it because they know that they're not even set up. Because again, authentication is that enabler of authorization. We're not doing adaptive authentication. Most of our applications still out there across the environment, we're still trying to think about things in terms of, well, that application doesn't accept PIV or doesn't accept CAC, so I have to go find a different multi-factor authenticator that application works with. That's the wrong mindset. The mindset should be, how do I make that application work with my centralized system localized to the environment where I've deployed it? Not whether or not the application can handle the authentication itself. So we still have a little bit of a culture shift to get to that point where we really understand what we need to do from a federation. I hear a lot of pushback around like, oh, well, I have mainframes in my environment, so I have to have usernames and passwords. But we've worked with customers to be able to actually federate access to a mainframe. And once I have federated access, now you have available to you any other tool system that you want. Hey, do you want to look at an XDR system for a mainframe? It probably isn't that relevant, but you certainly could. Why? Because the application becomes agnostic to all the adaptive features you bring in. You want to do PKI authentication to that legacy system? Not a problem at all. Because again, the application's not handling it. It has an established trust relationship with that federated engine. And once I've done that, now I can start feeding those entitlements from an authorization standpoint over to the other relevant systems. So we haven't conquered that yet. And there's still, unfortunately, a long way to go for it. We also still see a lot of silos within the ICAM systems themselves. So the identity proofing systems are solely separate in many ways from your access control systems. Even from the authenticators. So one of the problems I've had when I've talked with the FIDO Alliance, and I'm within the FIDO Alliance, and Ping Identity's been a member of it for a very long time, is we're like, hey, you don't have anything that attests to how the authenticator itself was bound to the end user. There's no attestation of identity within the actual FIDO standard. We have it in PKI because we have object identifiers, right? And that tells us what the usage for. And we know that it was issued from certain CAs. So we can actually trace it back to this, yes, is a CAC authentication certificate or a PIV authentication certificate. We know what that's going to mean from an AEL level, from a NIST Special Publication 863. But I don't have that concept within the FIDO. So I go and I talk to the FIDO Alliance and say, we need to bring that in. And say, well, actually, identity proofing, that's the problem of someone else. We're just giving you a phishing-resistant authenticator. So even within the ICAM communities, we have a little bit of separation and a little bit of a way to go from a culture perspective to bring it together. We are seeing a lot, and again, our partner, Beyond Trust, who wasn't able to come this time, where they understand, hey, I actually shouldn't authenticate the user. Let me go out and talk to my partners, whether it be Ping Identity or someone else, let them authenticate, and I'll take it from there. And that starts breaking down, because remember, our definition of ICAM, tools, policies, systems, all of that's plural. They're not singular. They're things that must be integrated together. So long-winded answer, but very much that's the state of the reality that we're in. With that said, it's getting a lot better. So some of the conversations I've had with the DoD OCIO have told me, don't show me a point solution. Show me a working integration. I want to see multiple vendor technologies working together because no one vendor out there is going to give me everything I need within Zero Trust. And so that insistence on working integrations is, I think, going to continue to push things in the right direction and solve those gaps. So, any other questions? All right, well, with that, I'll stick around for a few minutes, but thank you very much. Thank you for putting up with mandatory audience participation, and enjoy the rest of the conference and Hawaii.